So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar. As we've just been talking about, we have the lines muted in presenter mode for call participants, and during the discussion portion of the call, we will open the lines to make sure folks can get through, including all of the community members on the call and of course the peer reviewers themselves. So my name is Kelly Sayes, and my colleague Nolan Kraft and I have the pleasure of supporting Ocean Science Trust, the peer review panel, and all of you on the phone in a productive discussion this afternoon. We're really grateful to be here. The goal of today's discussion is to provide an opportunity for members of the Red Abalone community, so all of you, to engage in the Red Abalone peer review process, to share your scientific questions with the peer review panel, and to learn information about the peer review approach. And as I mentioned, as we sort of led into today's conversation, all of the webinar materials are available on Ocean Science Trust's Recreational Red Abalone peer review webpage. In the chat, there is a URL to it. It's a bit.ly that will take you there, bit.ly/Red Abalone. Or you're more than welcome to just search in your online search engine, Red Abalone Peer Review, and Ocean Science Trust webpage should be listed. Here you'll find the agenda and the PowerPoint slides, copies of the management strategies that we'll be discussing today, along with other background materials as that's helpful. So today's webinar is scheduled for 2 hours. We're going to conclude the session at 3 o'clock. Oh, and maybe, Erin, if you don't mind just advancing the slides if you haven't. Sorry, I'm probably have made my way through. This first one was the goal. No, you're good. The first one was a goal, and we're just here for the agenda. Thank you. So as part of the agenda as it's outlined, once we've finished up with some housekeeping items and some introductions, Ocean Science Trust will provide a brief overview on the recreational red abalone fisheries management to date, including the fisheries management plan as it relates to the scientific peer review process. We just want to thank everyone for their patience. There may be a number of you who have heard this kind of background information before, and it's our intention to ensure that everyone on the call is starting from the same sort of foundation of information to help and be engaged in this conversation. So we just thank everybody for their patience as we provide that additional sort of context and background. Our hope is to have the majority of the call focus on reviewing the science-based and research questions that many of you submitted over the last couple of weeks. Erin's going to share a bit more about this in just a moment, and we really look forward to some good information exchange for the majority of the conversation. And at the end of the conversation, we'll take a few minutes to just look ahead on where the FMP process is going, including some additional opportunities for community input and engagement. Following this webinar, Ocean Science Trust plans to develop a high-level summary of key themes and of the questions that were submitted both prior to today's conversation as well as new questions that may come up today. And those will all be put together in a summary document and then added as an appendix as part of the final peer review report and made available to the department to inform the FMP process. That summary of key themes, along with the webinar that we mentioned at the start, is being recorded. So the recording of the webinar will also be posted on Ocean Science Trust's Red Abalone webpage. Again, that URL is included in the chat. And a reminder again, if you have any trouble accessing today's materials or need any help troubleshooting all the way along, if you're having a hard time getting through with questions you may have, you're more than welcome to email us at abalone@calost.org, and we will get information out to you or help to bring the information that you're sharing in. During the discussion portion of the call, we respectfully request that each person limit their comments so we can be sure everyone has had an opportunity to be heard. There's a limited amount of time on this webinar and lots of participants. So we just want to make sure that the verbal comments are as succinct as possible and really focus on some clarifying questions and bringing in new questions and ideas. If your comment has been conveyed by another call participant, we'd really appreciate it if you could state your agreement or support or your perspective via the chat or email, and then to use the time on the call to bring in some additional questions as they're available. When you speak, we would really appreciate it if folks could state their name so we can clarify the source of the question as it's coming in, and also be able to speak to you directly, as it's just a little more personal. So we love doing that. And we will try our best to keep the conversation as orderly as possible. Again, appreciating there's a number of folks on the call, and really appreciate everyone's patience. Being mindful that there is limits on time. We certainly want to be respectful of everyone's time. If we are unable to answer questions that come in via email or chat, or I guess even verbal too, just due to time restrictions, or if we have any technical issues, sometimes that happens on these webinars, hopefully not. But please know that we will include all questions that come in as part of the key theme summary following today's discussion. So maybe just moving into, perfect, thanks Erin, to the agreement. So we want to acknowledge and just say out loud that we understand the sensitivity and sensitive and emotional nature of today's discussion and sensitivities around the topic. And so we're asking that everyone on the call participate within some guidelines, number of agreements that we're proposing, including participating in a respectful and constructive manner where the interests of all participants are considered, listening for understanding and openly discuss issues with others who hold diverse views, acknowledge and seek clarification and verify assumptions, to provide clear, concise comments. The additional comments can be shared via written form like email or chat. Personal attacks will not be tolerated, and to please put yourself on mute when not speaking, just to help minimize the background noise. And everybody is being very thoughtful about that in this moment. So thank you. If anyone has any concerns or questions about these agreements, please feel free to put that in the chat and we will be responsive to that. But we just ask everyone to collectively, everyone on the call, including myself, to abide by these agreements. And thank you in advance. So just before I pass it over to Erin, a reminder that the peer reviewers are in the middle of their peer review process. They're really in the meat of it, and still, in their journey have more questions perhaps than answers. They can certainly talk more about this for themselves. And our hope is that this webinar provides an opportunity for all of you, the Red Abalone community, to engage with the peer review panel, to share and discuss your science-based questions, and to help provide clarity. We're looking to have this opportunity for the peer reviewers and Ocean Science Trust, as it's helpful, to provide clarity about what is and what is not being addressed under the review, and to be able to be transparent about that. So this discussion is really intended to help complete the peer review process in terms of upholding that transparency within the peer review, and related communications around the peer review, while maintaining the independence and scientific integrity of the external peer review, which we understand from many folks we've spoken with within the Red Abalone community that is very important. So I'll pause. Erin, I'll check in with you to see if there's anything I missed, and then I will just turn it over to you, the program director with the California Ocean Science Trust team. Erin.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. No, I don't think you missed anything. As Kelly said, I'll just kind of keep working my way through, knowing that there'll be time soon to start to open things up for discussion. So just want to say, first of all, thanks to everyone who's joining in the call today. We're really thrilled to have you. Again, my name is Erin Ramanujam, and our team at Ocean Science Trust, including Jessica Williams and Haley Carter, are also on the webinar today, in addition to the Strategic Earth Support Team, Kelly Sace, who's just speaking, and Carolyn Kraft, in coordinating this external independent peer review of the two management strategies. We also just want to quickly thank Ocean Protection Council for funding this review, including these community engagement webinars. And to say, on the call today, we have almost the full complete peer review panel, 6 of the 7 panelists. I've seen them all come in. I know we didn't have a chance to test audio on everybody. We have both of the co-chairs, Jason Cope and Pete Raimondi. We have Karina Nielsen, Brian Tissot, Jan Zhao, and Will White on the phone today. Gavin Fay is a very integral part as well of the peer review panel, but could not be on this webinar with us today. So first, before we kind of dive into some of those other agenda items, as a reminder, earlier this month, we circulated a request to the Red Abalone community with an invitation to submit your research and science-based questions about the two proposed management strategies. And we also welcome questions related to the peer review process overall. Prior to today's webinar, we got over 50 questions and comments, which we have looked at with the peer review panel. And, you know, perhaps not surprisingly, the majority of these questions that we received were really in alignment and mirrored a similar path that the peer review panel has been on, and mirrored kind of the bins that the reviewers are considering during their own peer review. What you see on the screen now, these key themes, these are the main bins that we've identified from those questions that you've submitted. And this is what we've used to structure the agenda today. And when you think of these questions that you've asked or that you would like to ask today, you know, we want you to be thinking about, are there additional bins that might need to be added? We're not opening up the discussion quite yet. We'll get there in terms of discussing the particular bins themselves. But just a flag, if there are bins or things that you think are missing, I'm going to switch over right now, Kelly, to a place where she's going to be tracking some of this information. And apologies if I'm jumping the gun, Kelly. There's this.
That's okay. Erin, would you be open to just sharing this is perfect, and you could even read them here, but just sharing, just for folks who maybe aren't on the webinar and are reading or are listening via the phone, just sharing what those bins in general are?
Yep, I will definitely get back to that. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'll go back to the slide with the bins. Just a moment. Click. Okay. So what we're looking for, again, is not discussion on these bins, but things that we're missing. And just to recap, the key themes and bins that we got from the questions submitted by everyone were, how are the peer reviewers approaching their review of these two plans? Different types of indicators and changing ocean conditions related to productivity, including density indicators, reproductive indicators, including gonad and body condition surveys, questions about the length-based spawning potential ratio and the catch maximum sustainable yield, environmental indicators being used, including kelp, sea surface temperature, urchin densities, as well as questions about how these indicators perform under different scenarios, whether it's reopening, an already open fishery, changing ocean conditions, those types of things. And then we did receive a lot of questions that are more in the vein outside of these indicators and changing ocean conditions, but about management measure effectiveness and different things along those lines. So yeah, we welcome right now your thoughts. Again, thinking about the questions that you submitted or other questions that you were hoping to ask today. Would love to hear from folks if these bins are representative or if there's something that might need to be added. Those on the phone, you can press *6 to unmute yourself. Again, you can also email us at abalone@calost.org with ideas.
And you're also, this is Kelly, you're also more than welcome to use the chat function. Too. And this could be something, you know, I'll pause and let folks chime in as they need to, but this can also be something that if nothing comes to mind right away, then we can also revisit this as we go. Yeah, thoughts from folks on any bins you think we might be missing or ideas you had that you'd like to see reflected here?
Hi, Kelly. This is Jack Likens.
Hi, Jack. Please go right ahead.
Yeah, one question I know the peer review has asked, and both teams and a lot of fishermen have asked, and I don't think it's really clear here. I know it's not particularly associated with the science part of it, but it is, the question is, what would it take, what science do we need to decide on reopening a closed fishery? You know, because both of the plans at this point are dealing with, you know, managing an open fishery. So, and we don't have that any longer. So my question would be, what do we need to do to reopen a sustainable small fishery?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Jack. Yes, and that will definitely be something that we can discuss under this indicators, under different scenarios. It's definitely, we got a few questions asking about if that was something that the peer review might be covering, so we can talk through what to expect from this particular peer review in that vein.
Fantastic. Other bins or themes that folks have in mind that they don't see reflected? Yeah, please.
Hi, Kelly. This is Chris Voss.
Hi, Chris.
Yeah, good to talk to you. I have a kind of a general comment about this process in a kind of a general sense. The Ocean Science Trust earlier did a analysis of the density that the department was using to manage the fishery as outlined by the ARMP. And the result of that work was a great work product, but the reviewers kind of did what was described as they went outside their charge. And my thinking is that when you bring a bunch of really smart people together to analyze a very specific question, they might have observations in a general sense they want to make about the details of something they're looking at. And in that case, I felt as though they commented on the value of density as a management tool. And so my thinking is, in this context, maybe there should be actual space opened up. Instead of considering this, the action they took as going outside their charge, in a peer review process, maybe we can carve out a location that you very smart people can make comments about the work you're doing, the very specific work you're doing, what implications it may have on the bigger picture. So I just wanted to throw that out as something to consider as we, learn to use this peer review process in informing bodies like the Fish and Game Commission about their work and what quality that their work product can have in like I say, informing the commission in their decision making. That's the extent of my comment.
Great, and I will speak to that kind of question / comment a little bit, Chris. In a couple of slides when we're talking about the peer review process and the scope and where we're at, I would love to speak to that. And I think just based on time, I know that there's been a couple of things coming through the chat that perhaps we can flag on the Trello board, and I'll try to tap in on as well. But perhaps in the interest of time, Kelly, we should move on and just keep tracking, knowing that we've got some extra moments to make sure we're capturing these things.
That sounds fantastic. I'll do my best to populate the Trello, and then we can make sure we circle back when we get to those various bins.
Okay, great. And just to say out loud, because I don't think I explained it very well, the Trello board is where Kelly, and I'll try to go back and forth where it makes sense, where we can keep track of some of these things coming through on the chat, both for being able to discuss when we get to that part of the agenda, as well as if there are places just we weren't able to get to every question on today's webinar given the time and the number of folks that we can circle back. All right. Okay, so just really briefly, as Kelly mentioned, we wanted to spend some time just making sure that everybody has a good foundation. We've got folks coming from a lot of different areas, and making sure everybody kind of has some of the similar foundational information. Just a really brief background in terms of the F&P process and how the peer review kind of fits into that, why we're here in this peer review space. The Marine Life Management Act directs the state to ensure that fishing is sustainable, collaborative, responsive to changing conditions, among others. There's a lot of priorities under that legislation. And in this moment, as noted already, the fishery is closed and it's currently operating under the Abalone Recovery Management Plan. And given the recent declines and concerns about changing ocean conditions, it's really prompted the department to be ready and really noticing the need for a fisheries management plan to improve data collection and support timely management response. The proposed management strategies to be included in FMP is required by the MLMA to undergo external independent peer review prior to submission to the California Fish and Game Commission. And currently there are 2 proposed management strategies for consideration under this recreational red abalone FMP. There's the management strategy that's under review that's been proposed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And there's a stakeholder submitted management strategy led by the Nature Conservancy that is also under review. And in terms of the peer review process, just kind of wanted to give some clarity about where we're at and how this came into being. The peer review panel themselves are selected by the Ocean Protection Council Science Advisory Team Executive Committee. Sorry, that slide, just as I was reading out loud, realized is missing 3 words. Not by the Ocean Protection Council themselves. And this group of peer reviewers that have been put together, there are 7 of them, and these individuals come from all over the world. They specialize in a range of disciplines, including fishery science, ecology, oceanography, population dynamics of different types of species, including abalone. And it's really the peer reviewer's responsibility to make sure that the scientific underpinnings of the FMP are using the best available science to inform management approaches. The peer review panel is looking at all aspects of both plans because there's value in both. And we're inspired and excited about how some of these ideas can potentially really complement each other. Everyone participating on the peer review panel is doing this in service and is being really thoughtful about the fishery and how the fishery has changed over time. And everyone wants to see this fishery last long into the future. And we all need these various tools to ensure a successful management outcome in terms of how science can be helpful there. The peer reviewers are really dedicated to that outcome. And Chris, it just strikes me, I am going to pause on your question. I'm going to get to it in a couple more slides. Just to say that out loud, I haven't forgotten about you. Make a note to myself here. So in terms of the timeline, just wanting to note where we're at with things. In the spring, so back in March and April, the OPCSAT peer review panelists, so again, the Ocean Protection Council Science Advisory Team peer review panelists were selected. Documents that you can find online now, the terms of reference, which is really a fancy word for scope of the review, were developed. And Ocean Science Trust received the 2 management strategies to be under review. There's been regular coordination since the review began and communications with the peer review panel and the department and TNC, where Ocean Science Trust really serves as the coordinator and provides that interaction between the teams. We, in general, ask that there's no communication outside of Ocean Science Trust between the authorship teams and the peer review panelists to kind of ensure that there's no biasing of the peer review itself. And then here we are, there's about 4 or 5 weeks left under our current timeline for completing the peer review and making the peer review report public. And we're hosting this community engagement webinar now here in August to share information about the process and where we're at and the types of questions that are being asked and answered as a part of that peer review. Next steps coming up, again, we'll be completing the peer review report in late September, and we'll be making that public, posting it on our website. And we'll be holding a second community engagement webinar in October after the report is finalized. And that will just be a chance for once you've had a chance to read the report, you can come back and ask more questions, or perhaps there was something that wasn't clear, or there's something that you would like to comment on. There will be another webinar to do that as well. And then just want to note that I believe it is the plan for there to be some discussion of the peer review at the Fish and Game Commission meeting in October, on October 17th and 18th. All right, So with that, I'm going to get into the bulk of what we had really hoped to set time aside for today, but just want to pause for a moment and ask if there are any clarifying questions about the peer review process or where we're at before we move into the key themes.
And this is Kelly. Just a reminder, if you would like to come through via the phone, please press *6. Make sure your phone is unmuted, or you're more than welcome to send a note via the chat or via email abalone@calost.org. Perfect. So maybe some of those process-related questions will come up as you go.
Yep, that's totally fine. We can always, if something comes up, we're happy to go back. So as mentioned, we'd really like to spend the next hour or so to walk through the questions that we received from the members of the Abalone community. We plan to walk through each of the themes or bins that we previously highlighted and talk through them one by one. The plan will be that we're going to talk through questions that were received by the community, and then invite the peer review panel, primarily beginning with the co-chairs, the co-leads, to provide responses and some additional context and information. And then once they've had a chance to kind of initially reflect on those questions, then we'll open it up the lines for discussion and have the opportunity for folks to ask additional questions as needed. Anything else to add, Kelly, in terms of how folks can engage here?
I think this is perfect. We'll just navigate and update as we need to, as we go.
Perfect. All right. So again, these are the key themes. This is the order that we're going to be starting to walk through them on. Starting with this first one, how are the peer reviewers approaching the review of these two plans? And so we got a few questions around this. How are the peer reviewers thinking about the review of these two management strategies? Are the peer reviewers thinking about ways to integrate these plans? And I'll just say out loud, since this is more about the scope of the review, I'm going to answer this instead of turning it over to the peer reviewers. And just say that, the peer reviewers are really thinking about and approaching this review that's very unique holistically. They've been tasked with illuminating the scientifically based strengths and weaknesses of each of the management strategies, and they have the ability to provide any recommendations for improvements for each management plan or identify areas of clear synergy between these two documents. The peer review panel is not tasked with just picking one option over the other or crafting a new plan in totality based on their review of the documents. The peer reviewers are exploring areas of synergy, they're evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of each plan, and where appropriate, really identifying areas where both plans could be strengthened by utilizing components of the other plan, if appropriate, or areas where there could be ways to strengthen the plan independently of the other plan. With this in mind, the questions that the community has asked have been considered by the peer reviewers through this lens. And additionally, we at Ocean Science Trust and Strategic Earth really want to encourage the participants on the webinar today who have additional science-based questions or research questions to consider the management strategies that are under review from a holistic perspective. So I think that this is where, Chris, I just kind of want to take a moment to address your question, and then we can open it up either to the peer reviewers to say a little bit more about this, or other folks who might have questions about how this peer review is being approached, given that there's two management strategies. Chris, to answer your question, the place we're in with this review right now is that we're not able to change the scope beyond what's in the terms of reference that you see online. I think that this peer review can serve as a great way to be thinking about these two plans, be thinking about what's in them, potentially what's missing, and that conversation can really continue to go forward after this peer review is complete. And with that, I think I don't see anything coming through on the chat. Kelly, are we okay to move on?
Yeah, maybe I'll just, we could just pause just in this moment. Yeah, don't see anything coming in through chat or through email. So just want to check in, maybe just briefly check in with the peer review panel and see if there's anything to add here. And no pressure, but just to check in.
Yep.
And just a reminder to hit *6 if you'd like to unmute yourself. Okay, perfect. So we can always circle back and let's move on to the next bin.
Okay. All right. So this will start the key themes around that bin of indicators and changing ocean conditions. So this higher level bin considers everything, including density, environmental indicators, productivity indicators, length-based SPR, catch SMY, how to consider these indicators under different scenarios, reopening, whether the fishery is open. But we're going to start off with productivity indicators and start with density. We've got a lot of questions from folks around density, and so we've kind of given a few different categories of density questions. And what we will do is walk through each of those. I believe there's 4 categories of questions with the peer reviewers, with the peer review panel, and then we'll open it up to discussion once we get through all of the density questions that we received. So around density, one of the buckets of questions that folks really coalesced around was density survey design and methodology. Folks were curious about how did the surveys consider the cryptic nature of abalone? So are the surveys able to capture the fact that sometimes they're hiding under rocks and not necessarily on top, and how does that impact the survey? What are the differences between the rapid assessments and the standard density assessments? Is there a difference in the power of the analysis or the way that that information is used? Has CDFW changed their density protocol per the density survey methods from the peer review that happened in 2014 that Chris mentioned? Does the changing the survey protocol during the baseline years or after that period change the ability to make comparisons between years or comparisons between the baseline and future time periods? And so with that, Pete, I will turn it over to you to kind of speak to where the peer review panel is at in terms of how these questions kind of align with questions that you're asking or not.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Do you guys have a feedback on your end?
No. Does anybody else?
No feedback on this end.
Okay. So I'll talk and I'll get feedback on myself.
And just a gentle reminder to folks, if you aren't on mute, to please mute yourself, and that might help Pete. And we can do the same Ocean Science Trust on our ends.
Yep. Okay, are we ready to go?
Please go right ahead, Pete.
Oh, now we've suddenly lost you, Pete.
Yeah, now we can't hear you.
Let's see.
I have him here. I have him unmuted.
Mm-hmm. He was there just a moment ago.
Thanks, everyone, for your comments. And thanks, Pete, for yours.
One option might be, just while we're figuring Pete out, I don't know, Karina or Jason, if one of you guys would like to speak to this briefly while we figure out Pete.
Yeah, this is Jason. Hi, everyone. And Karina, are you on as well? I don't want to talk over you.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Oh,
There's Pete. Hi, Pete. We can hear you.
okay.
Okay. I'm going through the computer now. I thought that the phone was working. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good. Take it away, Pete.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we've got you.
I just
Okay,
think
you've got me now?
yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, so with respect to these metrics, we are considering all of them at this point, obviously. And I just want to go through a couple of them. One of them is, very quickly, is the methodology. And with respect to the cryptic nature of the abalone, I think that that's mostly addressed through the sampling scheme that has been used, where they have an expert group of divers or surveyors that go through and they count systematically. And so there may be some individuals that are not seen because of their cryptic nature, because they're under rocks, but there is no bias with respect to that. And so we think that that is probably fine with respect to any potential implications to the overall survey design or the results. The difference between a rapid assessment and a standard density assessment, just to give you kind of a background, the standard density assessments are these, they're a lot of work. They do surveys along transects, and they collect, in addition to information about abalone, they also collect information about habitat and size structure. And during the rapid assessments, which are motivated by particular circumstances like a crash or some sort of environmental set of conditions, then what you see is they would go out and they would do a subset of the pieces of it, collect a subset of the pieces of information that would ordinarily be collected. And mainly what they're trying to do is get a quick but important estimate of the density of abalone. So this is a way to make it rapid, is that they're not collecting the other pieces of information. The third is the density protocols have changed a little bit with respect to the density survey methods from 2014. But I want to also point out that there's really three periods that we need to talk about here. There is the period between, that was the ordinary operating period, which would have been just prior to the density review. There is a period from the density review until today, and then there is a period that will be implemented under the CDFW plan going to the future. And so we're in the process of reviewing any potential changes in the density protocols and how they might affect the management plan. And then the last thing is that there have been a couple of changes that have been made by CDFW relative to the baseline, but those were because of particular features that needed to be corrected. Importantly, one of the things that happened is that the MPAs have been implemented, and there is an overlap, a small overlap between areas of protection and a former area in which harvest had been allowed. And so they modified the density estimates, the baseline density estimates, to account for that overlap. So that is part of their management plan. And I think that's it with respect to this set of questions.
All right, great, thanks, Pete. Okay, and just to say out loud again, we're going to move through these different buckets of density questions, and then at the end we'll open it up to discussion about density to the whole group before we move on to any of the other productivity indicators. Okay, so some of the other questions that we got were in terms of how using density as an indicator for setting target catch as it relates to the management plan put forward by the department. Are the density survey methods, data collection, estimates, and analysis robust enough to manage the fishery in a timely manner? Is the way that the department uses density in their proposed management strategy a scientifically and statistically robust indicator? Again, there were some questions around, are there more limited site-specific monitoring and control rule provisions sufficient to account for that kind of spatial specificity of the abalone population dynamics, the way that they can kind of be different densities in very different locations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Pete or Karina, if you guys want to jump in there.
I can start. I just have to say that this is probably one of, if not the key question that surrounds the submission by Fish and Wildlife, and that is the use, but also the reliability of the density estimation. I think that everyone is in agreement with in the sense that given that density was reliably estimated, then it would be a very important indicator of the health of that system, the Abalone system, and would be quite useful in terms of the management. And so the real question, the one that we have not reconciled yet, but that's part of our reviews and our consideration, is the degree to which density as it's currently measured and potentially as it could be measured in the field, given the difficulty in doing field measurements, is likely to be a reliable estimator that could be used with respect to fisheries management. And that answer that I just gave kind of is the core to all these questions, and that is the degree to which density will be useful. And that is something that we are in the process of considering right now. And Corinne, if there's anything else you want to add, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I think you captured the essence of where we are. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for unmuting me. So also kind of related, you know, there were some questions around using not just density, but using baseline density to set target catch as it's proposed by the department in their draft chapter management strategy. And some of the questions around this kind of summarized here in terms of, is the baseline that has been established using data from 2002 to 2007 scientifically accurate and robust? Sorry, that was a bad hand swipe. We're not trying to mark things out as we go. And I don't know, Peter, Karina, I think that the answer that you just gave might get at that, but wondering if you want to elaborate any in terms of how, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the lines on the screen. Elaborate any in terms of how that baseline period, whether or not you guys are considering that as part of your review.
Yeah, I can address that, and then Karina or anyone else can join in. The question really is about the degree of accuracy and robustness that you need. And so I think one of the key questions is, given what's been going on in terms of the populations and the catch, and what we know about what the current conditions are, is the level of resolution that was present in 2002 to 2007 the level that would be needed to manage a fishery that's in decline and just going forward to make it sustainable. That's we considered that. I was part of the review panel 4 years ago. We considered it at the time, but at that time, the populations and the regional populations were in much better shape than they are now. And so that is one of the key things. It relates exactly to the question that I just addressed, which is the reliability of those density estimates and whether they are going to be useful for a management plan relative to other types of indicators that might be more precisely and accurately established. And that's a consideration we are undergoing right now.
Thanks, Pete. Karina, I'm not going to add more information. I'm just going to say, you know, these are the questions that we're being asked, are the same questions in many cases that the peer reviewers that we're dealing with and asking as well, and trying to get some good responses to.
Great, thank you. Okay. With that, I'm going to move us on, I believe, to the last density slide before we open it up for discussion. Two categories here remaining under density. So one set of questions that we got from a few different folks was related to the TNC-led stakeholder proposal around density, and does the TNC-led stakeholder proposed harvest control rule incorporate the density dependence of abalone into their analysis or operating models? Is the decision to eliminate density dependent data scientifically supported given the biological need for abalone to be close to neighbors for successful reproduction? And again, I'll turn it over to you, Jason, if you want to kind of speak to whether or not these are the types of questions that you guys are digging into as part of this review.
Yeah, thank you. Let me know if you have a hard time hearing me. Yeah, these are great questions, and I'm glad people are bringing them up. It's certainly something that our review panel noticed right away and have been working through. One of the issues when deciding whether something is incorporated and important or not is kind of considering the sensitivity of the results to putting something in the model or leaving it out. And so I think right now we're really digging into this issue because yes, we feel like you could bring in maybe some more reality as far as the density dependence at these low population levels for red abalone. But what we don't know is by leaving it out and using it to set catch limits, how much it matters. And so we're really trying to investigate this, and so it's a great question, and we're still wrestling with it. On that second part, that's a really good, another good observation that we noticed, and this is kind of in the spirit of this desire of kind of bringing the strengths of both of the methods together. CDFW has this information on density, and obviously low densities really matter here to red abalone, and so this idea of not having that in the TNC model, though it still has a certain level of performance, we're still thinking through if there's a way to kind of meld the two together and to bring mutual strengths together. So absolutely on both points, the review panel is thinking heavily on both of those things. So thanks for asking that.
Awesome. Okay, and then the last one here is we got many questions in terms of density and how it acts as an indicator given changing ocean conditions, whether it's harmful algal blooms, kelp bed, differences in kelp beds, differences in urchin densities. So how does the movement of abalone out of the deep waters and into the nearshore environments affect the density estimates? How are the different size classes handling the loss of food? How are these different types of things affecting the way that the density might or might not be gathering that type of information? You know, does the movement of these abalone affect the overall density measure or their statistical reliability? Pete, would you mind speaking to how the review, or whether the review is considering these types of questions?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we should have pointed out early, and I'll do it right now, is that neither of the two papers or plans at the time that they were initially written and considered really anticipated, nor did anyone, just to be clear, the complete crash of the system that has occurred in the last couple of years. And so, you know, things that we may say that might seem critical, they're not meant to be critical. They're just in recognition that things have really changed. And so we're not talking about an open fishery where you've got a management plan to ensure sustainability. We're really talking about a fishery that is currently closed and where there has been a massive crash in the populations. And so just to give that context, so it's clear that a whole bunch of bad things have happened to red abalone populations up in Mendocino and Sonoma coastline, and probably everywhere along the coastline to the north. And they are largely at this point due to these regional effects on environmental conditions that look like they have led to essentially starvation of the red abalone. And one of the consequences of that has been migration, apparent migration. We see it in our data from the subtidal into very shallow regions, as an example, into the intertidal or to that area that almost no one surveys, which is the open coast just below the intertidal zone. And so in contrast, as an example to what's been going on in the subtidal areas, there has been an increase in some locations of red abalone into the intertidal, which makes them actually more subject, if the harvest was open, that would make them more subject to harvest. Clearly, that can affect density estimates, you know, in the sense that if there's loss by movement rather than loss by mortality, you could have a change in the density estimates that would not reflect the population for a particular area. To a degree, that depends upon, you know, location to location, how close into the intertidal the Fish and Wildlife Survey's got. So there could be an aliasing of the densities or the population size, a temporary aliasing because the food resource has been going away shallower and shallower. This is true for everything. You know, you have a loss of kelp, you have a loss of food. The loss of kelp is likely due to urchins. And so environmental conditions have a lot to do with the populations that we have seen. Having said all of that, our data also suggests that there is no real size bias, meaning that perhaps the older ones, the bigger ones, took longer to die from starvation than the smaller ones, but there doesn't seem to be a really clear-cut size effect, meaning that some are more or less vulnerable to whatever has been causing probably starvation. And so there doesn't seem to be a size bias, at least with respect to our surveys. One of the things that's difficult is that because the populations have dropped so significantly, it's really it's a hard thing to do to estimate that kind of metric. But to date, it does not look like there's a difference in size vulnerability.
All right, great. And so I think at this point, what we'll do is we'll pause before we move on to any of the other questions around other indicators. And first, check in with Kelly and see if there's any questions or anything to add about things that have come through chat before we kind of open it up to a broader discussion.
Thanks. I think chat right now is clear. We'll circle back to it once we have made our way through the verbal discussion. So I think just checking in with folks, feel free to press *6. You're also able to raise your hand for those that are on the webinar. You can use the raise hand function in the chat, or you can hit *9 if you're just on the phone, and I believe that will indicate that you're looking to raise your hand. We'll try and track that. And just a reminder that if you have agreement or support of what's been talked about thus far, to please use the chat function. But if you have new questions or clarifying questions for the peer reviewers, we would welcome those at this time within that sort of density umbrella that we've just been talking about.
I think I unmuted myself.
Yeah, please go ahead. Who's this?
This is Joshua Russo.
Hi, Josh. Please, Joshua, please go right ahead.
Okay, one thing I want to say about the reliability of density, one of the problems with the density is the way that the department uses it and the lack of trust that the public has in it. And when we had these emergency situations in the last few years, the department altered their protocol. And then what they did was not available to us, how they altered their protocol, how they changed the way they read the data and accounted for the altered protocol. So what is to tell us, I mean, if we write down, this is what we're going to do with density and this is how reliable it is, how can we rely on that if the department is able to change that at a moment's notice or on a whim and not tell us how they changed it or document it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Joshua. This is Erin Ramanajam at Ocean Science Trust. And, you know, I think that in terms of the peer review, these guys can really, this peer review panel and this peer review can be really helpful in terms of speaking to what is within the confines of the two documents that are under review, and just noting that I know that folks at the department are listening in today and welcome having discussions on things that are kind of outside the scope of this review, which it sounds like this might be. At the end of the webinar, I'll have an email address of Sankey Master of the department, and just also noting again that there's the commission hearing meeting coming up in October, and that's another great space to continue this type of conversation.
Hi, Aaron.
Kelly, this is Jack Likens.
Sorry, Jack, hold on. Yeah, Jack, hold on one sec. Was there someone else who's coming through?
It was Chris.
Yeah, Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, perfect. Let's start with Chris and then go with Jack. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick. My concern is that I collaborated with the department, and we did a great deal of surveys at San Miguel Island. And I'm also a member of the RAC, the Recreational and Abalone Advisory Committee. And as a RAC member, I know what amount of money that is generated through the tag sales for the North Coast recreational fishery, or had been prior to the closure. And my concern is that density, because of my own personal experience, is an expensive thing to acquire. And when the Ocean Science Trust sponsored that previous review, one of the recommendations was increased surveys. And in this situation where clearly the state has less resources at its disposal due to the fact that the fishery is closed and there's no longer tag money coming in, and acquiring density data at a level that is relevant to inform good management is exceedingly costly. Wouldn't it be within this body's purview because there's a need to answer this question, because cost isn't something we can just pretend isn't a factor. And I think it would be helpful if this body looked at cost in relationship to this analysis, so that they can inform the commission in a meaningful way about something that is, kind of critical.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. This is Erin. I thought I would just jump in a little bit about the scope of the review, and then happy to turn it over to the peer reviewers to talk about how you guys are thinking about this as well. So again, this is Erin, Ocean Science Trust. So in terms of the scope of the review, we're really looking at the scientific elements. And so this review is definitely looking at, the statistical reliability of the density surveys and how it's analyzed and how it's used and what level of information you need to have to be making good scientific conclusions, and that, that information then can inform perhaps a discussion about cost, but that's really outside the bounds of science or outside the bounds of the review to say, like, what's a reasonable level of cost. With that, I'm happy, then I think I heard someone from the panel chiming in.
Yeah, this is Jason. I just wanted to add, that's definitely something that the review team has acknowledged. And I think in a like-mindedness, one question that we've asked both of the analytical teams was how they felt about their particular data streams being able to be sustained in time, like into the future. And you can attribute some of that to cost, but you could also contribute some of that to the technical ability to maintain those data streams. And so I just wanted to affirm that while we're not going to be doing a cost analysis, and that it is outside of our responsibility, we are thinking ahead on whether you can maintain some of these data sets and getting that input from the teams.
Thanks, Jason. Jack, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Erin. My question is for Pete, I guess, because he explained the difference between the rapid assessments and the regular protocol. Pete, as I understand it, one of the big differences in the rapid assessments, a diver will go down and maybe do as many as 4 shortened transects on one dive, whereas normally those transects would be moved almost 70 meters apart, which was a requirement of standard transects. Wouldn't that have a pretty big significance on the statistical outcome of a shortened transect versus a normal transect?
So I'm going to be really annoying. I'm going to jump in and answer about scope of the review real quick, and then happy to have Pete chime in. This is Erin again. Just to say out loud, the spot that the reviewers are in right now in terms of process and timeline is that they're very much, asking these types of questions of themselves and of the team so that they can formulate their thoughts and recommendations around them. I'm not sure that they're in a spot yet to that they've really come to agreement on where they're at. They're still very much information gathering. So being able to answer specific questions like that in this moment isn't really something that they're going to be able to do on this webinar, but something that they're diving into as a part of the review. And I don't know, Pete, if you want to chime in there about how, if a question like that is something that is going to be answered down the road.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at I'm looking at the documents that have been provided to us with respect to the rapid assessments. And again, this is something that I think, as Aaron was just talking about, should be directed to Fish and Wildlife. But in their documents, it basically says rapid assessments will focus on counts of abalone within transect survey areas, including the numbers of dead and living abalone. Habitat assessments, meaning the algal cover and substrate and abalone size measurements, will not be included unless these factors are expected to be relevant to the sources of mortality. And so what we know is that this rapid is intended to get really quick counts of density. My sense is in the same transects, but not including these other features, depending upon what they are worried about, not including size frequency and not including the habitat and substrate.
Awesome.
Thanks, Pete. Just to clarify, I mean, if there's somebody from the department that can clarify the difference in the rapid and the normal surveys, is it true that the rapid surveys do not require 70-meter separation in transects, as do the normal? And my question, Pete, would be to you guys, I don't care if you answer it right this minute, would be, if that is true, wouldn't that affect the outcomes?
Great, thank you for that clarification, Jack. And yeah, I think it's definitely a conversation to continue to have with the department on all ends, in the vein of information sharing.
And just to say out loud, Erin, I'm so sorry. Just to say out loud on that note, I am tracking a number of parking lot items on the Trello board, which we can circle back to at the tail end of the meeting, of things that would benefit potentially from follow-up conversations, whether this with the department or others, and I will track those as we go.
Great. And I'll just say out loud, noting the time, we've got a lot to cover today. Please continue to use the chat function if there are follow-up questions. Again, we'll be able to circle back on questions, knowing that there's a lot of folks on the line today that not everybody is going to be able necessarily to ask all of their questions today, but that there's still an opportunity to have them be heard through the chat function, through follow-up with us after the webinar. So with that, Kelly, I'm going to move on to the next set of indicators. So again, continuing in the vein of productivity indicators, thinking about reproductive capacity. There were a lot of questions around some other reproductive indicators, including looking at the different gonad and body conditions. Some of the questions we received around the reproductive indicators utilized by the department, the gonad size, the body condition. Is there a scientifically proven link or relationship between the estimate and the abalone's ability to reproduce? Is there a scientific basis that changing the size limit to greater than 7 inches will improve the reproductive capabilities of abalone? And so that's everything. I'm just looking at my notes. With that, Pete, I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk about how you guys might be, not how, but if you guys are considering questions like this, and if these are kind of inside or outside the scope of your review.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's tied up in this, and we have talked a lot about this, and we're still in the consideration phase. And just, I'm sure all the people that have been fishing these things know this, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, abalone, they're dioecious, meaning they've got males and females, and they have to be pretty close together, typically, and they spawn external sperm and eggs, and so they need to be pretty close together in order to have successful fertilization. And I bring that up for a number of reasons. One is, that's an important attribute that you might be able to get with respect to density or something like nearest neighbor, which is how close individuals are to each other, because there's been a lot of work, both theoretical and also other empirical work, that suggests that nearest neighbor, how close you are to other individuals, affects fertilization success. So that's a pretty big deal. There has been a lot of other work that, and they brood their gametes, and so you can think of the shell volume as a proxy for how many sperm or how many eggs an individual can actually have, because that's within that volume. And so in theory, there should be a relationship between the amount of volume that an individual has and the number of gametes that it can produce, which could then lead to more fertilized eggs, which could then lead to more babies. And so these things, in theory, all are linked together. Now, the one kind of bugaboo about all this stuff is that and we're considering these things, is that assumes that the animal is healthy. And up until these things fell off the rock, recently, a big animal would look like it's fine, except you probably wouldn't see the foot very well. And if you try to pull it, it would pop off. But in terms of the actual shell size, it might think, oh yeah, that has a high reproductive capacity. But if the body condition is poor, or if the gonad is poor, it is not really ripe, then they're not going to be very reproductive. And so these are exactly the types of questions that we're struggling with, mainly because of this recent event where we are in a situation where we haven't been in very often, where just looking at the shell might not tell you much about the reproductive capability of the animal, because it might not be linked to its body condition or the gonad index. So getting to the second thing, which is there a scientific basis to changing the size limit to greater than 7? Well, in theory, that should increase the reproductive capacity of the population, because those individuals, in theory, are going to, and Laura Bennett-Rogers, who works for the Fish and Wildlife group, she's done a lot of work where it's suggesting that there is actually increased reproductive capacity, assuming that the eggs and the sperm are fine, as they get bigger. And it's just a volumetric relationship. Now, there has been some discussion about whether there's senescence or something, but given that there isn't any senescence, then a bigger individual is going to produce more eggs and sperm in general. And so increasing the take size should potentially increase the number of gametes, which should increase the number of babies. These are all shoulds. And again, in the context of what happened recently, we're evaluating exactly these considerations.
All right. Anything that other peer review panelists want to add in terms of the scope of the review before we open it up? All right, great. Then we'll open it up to folks for other questions about these particular indicators. And feel free to unmute yourself, *6, or use the chat function. Otherwise, we will move on.
This is Josh again.
Hi, Josh.
Am
Please
I
go
unmuted?
ahead. No, you are absolutely
Yeah,
Please go right ahead.
Okay. In regards to the last statement made that a larger individual will breed more, at what point, if the point of necropsy isn't documented, then the statement, I don't think you can use it. I mean, if you don't document at what point they stop being more productive in relation to size, then it's kind of an incomplete statement. So that's my only comment.
Great, and we'll have Kelly make a note of that in the Trello board, perhaps.
We have one other question that came in via the chat. Curious about the MSY, how the MSY is determined with length-based SPR when the abalone is atrophied, and how would that information be applied for viable abalone management measures?
Maybe that's a good segue into our next indicator topic. And I'll just, Kelly, you make a note in the Trello, and I can hear someone coming through.
Hi, Aaron, this is Chris Voss. And I just wanted to make one brief comment about the last topic. my experience, I was a commercial abalone diver for many years, and my experience was that when you came on to one, you found others, and we kind of have this sense that they aggregate, obviously, for reproductive success. And I'd like to add to this notion that if in fact you increase the size limit, you have a spin-off benefit of preserving aggregations, because you would come to a cluster of, say, 6 or 7 abalones on a rock, and they would vary in size, sublegal to legal to above legal. And if you were to just take a bigger size, then the potential of preserving aggregations is greater. So there's a benefit to kind of the nearest neighbor concept to increasing the size limit, and that's not something that is often talked about, but there's a legitimate contribution there that should be considered.
Great, thank you, Chris. And I think in the interest of time, this is my suggestion is going to be, Kelly, that we move on and keep using the Trello board for this. Does that make sense to you, Kelly?
Absolutely, that sounds fantastic. Chris, your comments are noted, and as there's time at the end, we'll circle back, but if not, know that they will be included as part of the key theme summary.
Of course, thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
This is Jack Likens again. Could you add one other thing to that? I know with the gonad index, it's a measurement of the size of the gonad. Is there any particular science I'd like to know that says a gonad of X millimeters or centimeters long equals good reproduction and Y is bad? I mean, how did we determine the actual number there? And the same question about body condition. That's a subjective measurement. How can we use a subjective measurement like that to determine whether or not an abalone is actually reproductive just by looking at the body condition? Are there studies that go in and count the gametes in a gonad of a certain size or a body condition of a certain size? Because I've been seeing this problem with small gonads and male abalones for a long time. That's been happening 10 years. Anyway, I don't expect an answer to that, but I think that the panel should ask themselves that question, and I'd like to know the answer to it. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jack, and again, noting that question. Okay, I'm going to move us on here. Just to say out loud, we're a little bit behind schedule, so we'll do our best to make sure we're getting to everything, and I'll just note and ask the peer reviewers so that we can leave enough room for discussion and other folks to chime in to kind of try to keep your thoughts a little succinct, and then if people have things that they want you to expand on, they can ask about that. So continuing down the indicators thread here, looking at the length-based spawning potential ratio and the catch maximum sustainable yield, folks were curious about, does the movement of abalone affect the way that the Nature Conservancy harvest control rule works? We heard that question before, but it's relevant here as well. Does the Nature Conservancy harvest control represent a scientifically sound approach to managing a fishery? Would it potentially allow for harvest on depleted populations or under unfavorable recruitment or abundance conditions? And with that, Jason, I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk through whether or not these are the types of questions that you guys are asking, and whether or not these are types of questions that are within the scope of your review.
Sure, thank you. And there was also that question on length-based SPR setting catches. Maybe I can clarify that too. But yes, these are all questions that we have asked ourselves or within the realm of things that we are considering. And the movement of abalone, I mean, technically with length-based SPR, you can alter the way that it interprets length-based methods to incorporate what part of the population you are actually sampling. But if something is what we call dome-shaped or a severe drop in the selectivity at higher ends, that can sometimes create a problem and make length-based SPR more more of a conservative measure, meaning that it says the population is doing maybe worse than you think it is. But those are things that we are definitely investigating and asking ourselves and considering as we weigh the many things that are on our mind. The TNC harvest control rule is very, I think, similar, or you would say typical to many fishery management control rules, in the sense that it uses an indicator to then adjust catches, and these indicators come both from the length-based SPR measure of the spawning potential ratio and then the catch MSY estimate of catch, and it's using these things kind of together as multiple indicators. So I don't know if that clarifies, but the length-based SPR, that's not actually setting a catch limit. It's creating a measure of stock status that is then used to help indicate whether you should adjust, whether it be catches or effort. You can adjust bag limits and other things like that as well, and they consider both of those things. In their simulation, in the materials presented to the review panel, we've been able to look at their simulation results, which is a lot of output, and it did include a variety of different recruitment scenarios, higher or lesser recruitment, and how these multiple indicators work together to inform the population. So we do have that to review. We still, as we said before, are asking ourselves, what about when it's really, really, really low density, and how does that all play in? So we're still trying to figure out how that might play in. But there are some results with low and high recruitment events, as well as different natural mortality scenarios that we can kind of look on to see how this approach works.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jason. Wondering if you want to take just a moment here to open it up to folks. Again, you can come through the chat or *6 unmute yourself. We might have time for maybe just one out loud.
Any questions from folks on the call you'd like to add? Any clarifying questions to what Jason just shared? And again, in addition to the chat, you're also more than welcome to submit anything written via the email abalone@calost.org. Okay, maybe we can move on to the next, Erin, and we can always circle back as needed.
Yep, totally. All right, that helps us with time. All right, so in the vein of the environmental indicators, we got questions around those too. Folks were curious if the review would be considering questions like, are the environmental indicators and triggers set in the department proposed management strategy accurate and scientifically rigorous, for specifically speaking to kelp canopy, water temperature, urchin densities? How do the MPAs and populations inside the MPAs factor into the population estimates and the impacts of fishing and environmental conditions? Could those population dynamics inside the MPAs bound models? Wondering, Pete, if maybe you want to speak to if these are types of questions that will be in the scope of the review, or things that you guys are not going to be able to tackle as part of the review.
Well, it depends upon which set of questions. So there's a set of questions. These are great questions, by the way. There are things that we're all interested in that have to do with environmental factors, and the environmental factors that are listed are all really important. You know, whether it be water temperature, or kelp canopy, or urchins, or any of these other things, they're related, and they have dramatic consequences. We've just recently seen in terms of abalone populations, and so they are indicators. A big question is, you know, when will they indicate something? And so whether they're going to be post hoc or, you know, a priori, meaning will they indicate something is likely to go badly in the future, and so you can use them in advance of something going bad, or are they going to be something that is simultaneous with the impacts to the population? So that's one of the key issues. We're considering that. One of the key things that was also brought up in this question, which is, you know, in what way can MPAs be used kind of to calibrate populations? And And Will White might want to jump in here at some point too, but you know, one of the key ideas, not just with abalone, is that the population size and the dynamics that occur within an MPA might give a good reference point to what's going on outside where there is take. It's unlikely, although theoretically possible, that environmental conditions could change the dynamics inside an MPA versus outside. It's possible under certain sets of conditions, but we're not anticipating that being part of our review, which is the difference in the dynamics driven by environmental factors and how they might be different between MPAs and non-MPAs. And Will, if you want to jump in any way and talk, that'd be great.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and just to add in the thought that that's something, you know, the idea that you can use MPAs as a reference for a fishery is not a new idea, but we're still working out the best way to do it. And part of the problem is that after you put the MPA in, it takes a while for those populations to closely resemble, you know, a pristine or unfished, unharvested population. And it's not always clear that at the time that you might want to use them as that sort of reference, that they're at that point yet.
Great, thank you. I see a couple of folks that have raised their hand. I'm not sure how we technically handle that. So I think that for folks who just raised their hand, I think that Alan Joe, you're being unmuted, so go ahead. We cannot hear you.
Alan Joe, are you there? Have you pressed *6? Or you might have your mute button on your phone still pressed because you were being so thoughtful.
Yeah. All right, we will circle back to you, knowing that we have unmuted you on our end as well. Feel free as well to email in a question to abalone@calost.org or chat it in. Wondering if there are other folks who have questions around this, or perhaps there was something in the chat box that came through for environmental indicators.
We do. We have something from Nancy here, and maybe I'll just read it out. Since we don't know what we don't know about the future of our abalone fishery, just to be clear, will the future management plan allow for changes in survey methods based on weird or unusual changes in the environment? Will the changes in methods be adopted with public comment, or just as needed and as they see fit by the department? Will there be any oversight on those changes by anyone else?
Great questions. In terms of this peer review, these guys, the peer review panel is looking at the way that the methodologies are currently outlined in those draft strategies from both teams, including the department, that are on our website. In terms of future changes and what's within regulation or outside of, those are great questions for the department, or to take to the Fish and Game Commission meeting in October. And again, at the end of this presentation, we'll have some email information to share for your main contact at the department, and can also continue to point those types of policy questions and management decision type questions to the commission meeting coming up in October. Oh, we've got a hand raised.
Hi, Eric.
Yeah. Oh, hold on. We're gonna. Hi, is that Alan Joe?
Oh, can you hear me? Okay.
Yay! We can hear you. It's working.
Hi, this is Jocelyn Enavoldson, and the first question on the slide here is one that I was really interested in. Of course, the environmental indicators in the face of changing ocean conditions of kelp, both historical and current kelp density, sea surface temperature, and urchin densities. My question is actually slightly different than what is up there. I'm hoping that we can get a comparison from the peer review team of the approach that each of the management strategies takes, so that we can kind of see you know, the difference in what the management strategies are looking at. So is that accurately captured in the notes?
Yes. Yes, and you know, the peer reviewers are still working on the review itself, and it's within their scope to think about, just as you're saying, kind of what's being able to evaluate what's going on within each plan. It's not necessarily within their scope to make comparisons, although it's up to them to decide if they want to do that where it's appropriate. And yes, just to say out loud, that's also a great question that I heard in there. All of the questions that you submitted, while we use them to put these slides together and definitely pared things down or try to put things in similar buckets for today's conversation in the interest of time, all of those questions are captured verbatim that everybody has submitted.
Aaron, this is Jack Likens again. I just have one, I think it's a scientific question about the environmental indicators, kelp canopy, water temperature, and urchin densities. There are specific numbers associated with each one of those things. I think the kelp canopies, 30% of 2008, water temperatures, 15 degrees Celsius, urchin densities, 5 per square meter. How scientifically verifiable are those specific numbers as indicators? And why wouldn't you have a range? Or maybe kelp canopy is one thing, but urchin density is another thing. How are they going to be used in the management? Are they going to be just subjective? Oh, well, kelp canopy is this, but water temperature and urchin densities are all right, so we can't consider, you know, reopening or doing a density survey. I just don't understand from reading the department's plan how they're going to be used other than subjectively. And I don't think we really want very many subjective things in our management plan. We want it to be clear and transparent.
Thank you for that, Jack. And just in the interest of time, I'll give you a quick response and just also say that we're going to note that in the Trello board as well. You know, it is within the scope of this review to be looking at all of the proposed indicators from both teams and to kind of be able to discuss whether or not there's scientific backing for them and how scientifically rigorous they are, and provide recommendations if there are places where they can have more scientific rigor brought in. So that's something that's absolutely within the scope of this review. And just to say out loud, we'll note that question in the Trello board as well. I think, Kelly, does it make sense to move on to the next section, or I haven't been tracking, I can't see the chat. So.
Yeah, I think we're good in chat. I think just to emphasize, if anyone's having any trouble getting through, to please use the chat as that's helpful, or email us at abalone@calost.org. But I think we can move on to the next bin.
Okay, great. Okay, so this was noted earlier. Under this section, we have a few different bins before we move on in terms of moving outside the indicators and changing ocean conditions. Here we're thinking about indicators under different scenarios. Abalone recovery was a bin that we got a lot of questions in, and the next will be questions around reopening, and a couple of questions around kelp and how that plays in. So some of the questions that we got were around how long will it take for the population to recover, considering the likely long-term impacts of global warming. Is it defensible to use historic density levels to establish criteria for fishery reopening? Should new reduced criteria be used to establish a sustainable fishery at a smaller abalone density and catch level? And Jason, I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk through whether these questions are within the scope of the review or not, in terms of how science can be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I will say these questions are definitely on our mind. Whether there's something that we can really truly address in this review is mostly unlikely, because there just needs to be more information gathered, to be honest, to understand what these answers could be. But I can't say that they don't flood our minds here and there wondering what it could be. We've actually talked that third bullet point. We've talked about this idea of a small fishery and the trickiness in conducting something like that. So we've talked a little bit about it, but again, I'm not sure that's within our necessary our emphasis and what we're going to write up and report and certainly recommend. It seems a little outside that, but again, it comes into our discussion. It's definitely on our minds, and I guess if we ultimately deem it appropriate where it fits into us reviewing the scientific information provided to us, possibly, but I would say unlikely. And Aaron or anyone else can correct me if they think otherwise, but I think it's unlikely we're going to comment all too much about that.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, and I'm just going to say out loud that this is going to be similar, a little bit similar to the density conversation, where we just have 2 or 3 slides that we'll go through before we open the lines of communication for discussion again. So another bucket of questions that we had were around, I think this was mentioned earlier as well, were around indicators under different scenarios and how each of the strategies are thinking about reopening. So some of the questions we received were, are the different elements of reopening under the department plan scientifically sound and robust? Are the thresholds scientifically robust and relevant for tracking changes in the population and making management decisions about reopening? And Pete, I'll turn it over to you to kind of think through and talk about how you guys are thinking about reopening, whether that's inside the scope of your review or not.
Well, we think it is within the scope. We've kind of made it within the scope, and we've asked both TNC and Fish and Wildlife to provide us information about how they view the possibility of reopening and how each of their plans might accommodate metrics for reopening. We're in the process of evaluating. This has been something that's just happened very recently, so we've gotten a lot of information very recently, and we're in the process of reviewing both sets of information, both from TNC and from Fish and Wildlife, with exactly these questions in mind. That's all I can say at this point, because we're really just reviewing their 2 approaches at this point.
Great, thank you. Okay, and the last question on this slide is around kelp, and it's come up in conversation a bit before. And one of the questions, we got a few questions in different veins around kelp. The one that's reflected here is about should the fishery be completely closed until the kelp beds return? And this is, I'll turn it over to you, Pete, and I'll just reframe a little bit around the scope of this peer review. You know, that you guys are really, the peer review panelists are really here to help think about things from a scientific perspective, and then decisions about keeping a fishery open or closed are fully within the purview of the department and the Fish and Game Commission to make those types of decisions. Pete, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to how you guys are thinking about kelp, either as an indicator or just as a component of the ecosystem in terms of your review.
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts. One is, it is an indicator, at least under the Fish and Wildlife model. But one thing to keep in mind is that the proposed way to assess kelp is based upon essentially aerial photographs or aerial imagery or Landsat or some sort of remote sensing of kelp beds that are along the coastline. And these are primarily Nereocystis, the bull kelp beds. And they're a little bit difficult to resolve, but it's possible. Having said that, there are a lot of different kelp species, but they're just not visible from the air. And so we are not going to take a position on whether they should be closed until the kelp beds return. We're going to make comments upon the use of a particular metric, which is these aerial, as an indicator. the possible return of the food supply, but note that there are other things that abalone eat besides Nereocystis, which is the one species in that region. There's a little bit of Macrocystis, but mostly Nereocystis. That's the one species that can be resolved remotely and over the spatial scale that people are interested in without going and diving on the beds themselves.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then also just to say out loud, I am planning on opening it up for discussion on all of these different indicators under different scenarios. Just going to move on to the last slide before I do that. Some other questions that were kind of harder to bend but still fit under this indicators under different scenarios were our research and monitoring needs comprehensive to allow the department to collect and maintain essential fishery information necessary to achieve management targets for stock? Are there any priority gaps in research and monitoring that should be addressed or included? And how are both plans taking into account the different habitats in the area fished? I will answer a couple of these and then I'll turn it over to you, Jason, to speak more on behalf of the panel, and I'll just speak to the scope of the review. You know, the two documents that are on our website are the two documents under review. And so we are not peer reviewing just to say out loud, we're not peer reviewing the other chapters of the FMP. It's the draft section that is on our website. So we're not looking at, the peer review panel is not looking at the essential fishery information. Additionally, given the scope of this review and the just large tasks that the peer review panel has, we at Ocean Science Trust have not put in the scope of this review for them to identify any priority gaps in research or monitoring, and not to be prioritizing anything that they do identify. It's not within the scope of that review. And then Jason, I'll turn it over to you to kind of address any of those questions or the one in terms of different habitats in different areas and how they might be impacted differently under different environmental conditions.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. I think you covered it well, that last one. We're definitely considering, that is within the scope of the discussions we've been having, and habitat is very important, and there are spatial components to each of the two teams of analysts and what they're doing. So that's well within the scope of what we talk about. We talk about it a lot. It is important. Not sure what else to say beyond that. So if there's any specific questions with that, I welcome, but I can assure you that we do talk about that.
Great. Okay, so actually I'm getting handsy with the slides. With that, I will pause and I'll open it up to any of the other peer reviewers on the panel. If you guys have any additional thoughts you want to share before we open it up to discussion. With that, if folks have any questions, would love to hear from you. *6 to unmute yourself, or using the chat function.
Hi, Erin. This is Jack again. I'm sorry to ask so many questions, but this is really bringing up a lot of good questions that us fishermen have had for years and years and years. And this last thing we talked about, how both plans are taking into account different habitats in the fish areas. We know for a fact pretty much that as we move further north, the densities of abalone become less, and as we move further south, the densities of the red abalone become less and less. So Mendocino and Sonoma County are basically in the heart of it, but what we're managing is beyond that. We're managing Maria del Norte and Humboldt. And those areas have very small densities of abalone compared to Mendocino and Sonoma. So how could we possibly use densities to determine the health or reproductive capability of those areas outside of the center of our management area?
I think what I will do, Jack, is just note your question in the comments in the Trello board.
That's been
knowing
done.
that. Oh, sorry. Thanks. And certainly welcome the peer review panels if you guys want to add anything about whether or not questions like that are within the scope of the things that you're addressing during your review. Welcome that as well. Noting the time, we'll likely be moving on to the next and last bin soon. All right. All right. So were there anything else from the chat or folks? Okay. With that, I'm going to move us on to this last key themes bin, and you will be hearing from me, Erin, a lot more. This is definitely in the vein of the scope of the review and in terms of what the peer review panel can address and will not be addressing. We got a lot of questions around different management measures and their effectiveness in terms of are changing start times appropriate, are changing the length of the fishing season, is it having the right impact on how much catch is being taken. Really in that vein of, even though it's around different management measures, but just curious if the different management measures that are being proposed, are they effective at regulating catch? And we just want to be able to share that, this is something that's outside the scope of this review, and that the department really welcomes discussion around this with them. They're listening in. We encourage you to reach out to Sonky Mastrip at the department. He's the environmental program manager of the invertebrate program with your thoughts and questions. We can share his email information with you. You're also welcome to bring these types of questions and concerns to the upcoming Fish and Game Commission meeting. We also got, this is also in the vein of management measures, but we did get a lot of thoughts and questions around poaching, wondering if, I see it, if I look down at the bottom, there's Sonky's email address on the slide. So we got a lot of questions around poaching and wondering if the measures and the enforcement that the department has are viable for dealing with poaching of red abalone. And in terms of the scope of this review, if it's in the vein of management measure effectiveness, that's not something that this panel is going to be speaking to. The place where they are thinking about poaching is just as it plays out in terms of either plan, and just any inherent uncertainty in how any of these indicators might or might not be working when you have uncertainty around poaching levels. And then lastly, we got a lot of questions around urchins, just not just in the vein of what you've heard the peer review panel speak to already in terms of urchins as an indicator, which is very much inside the scope of this review, to be thinking about how that plays into understanding abalone populations, but a lot of questions in terms of, will urchin culling in select areas restore the diversity of marine life and act as sanctuaries from urchins to repopulate the coast when conditions improve? And again, in terms of the scope of the review, these are all really great questions that folks all along the coast are grappling with. For this peer review, it's not within their scope or necessarily this particular peer review panel's expertise to be able to help suss out what types of recovery actions could be helpful. And again, the department has a lot of activities going on in this vein, and they really welcome you to be able to reach out to them, to speak to them directly about their efforts, to be able to share your concerns with them about any of the management measures, about poaching, about urchin culling, and again, being able to take these thoughts and considerations to the Fish and Game Commission is another place where you can be sharing these thoughts and concerns and questions. with that, I will pause and see if there's any additional questions that have come up from folks as we've made our way through this, whether it's around some of those last bins, or if there's something else that has come up that you would like to be able to ask. And turn it back over to Kelly to help me navigate this last space.
Absolutely. So just wanted to check in, I think, in general to see if there were any other sort of science-based or research questions that folks came into today's discussion wanting to highlight or share that haven't been discussed yet. Okay. And so one of the questions, we had sort of more of a process related questions for all of you, just as we're getting to the tail end of things. Ocean Science Trust, as Erin mentioned, has captured all of the questions that came in prior to today's webinar, and certainly we've captured those from today as well. And we can go to the Trello board in a moment, just make sure we have everything captured accurately. It's my long way of saying, do folks feel like it would be helpful for us to not only have the key theme summary, where maybe we're sort of binning things like we did in the webinar, but also to have a bit more of a, I guess, just how best to share the questions. Do folks want to have the more verbatim questions that came in so that you can see them? You could put together a table or something along those lines. That may or may not be needed, but we just wanted to put it out there and see if you wanted the sort of original list of questions, if that would be helpful. And feel free to, I see Jack saying yes. Perfect. I was just going to say, feel free to chat your response. And maybe the question is, does anyone think that wouldn't be helpful? Thanks, Nancy. And I guess, Brandy, you're asking the question itself. So I'm thinking you might think that is an okay idea too. All right. So awesome. Perfect. Fabulous. And so I think, again, feel free to let us know if anyone feels other ways. Wonderful. So we will then work as part of the key theme summary. And I'm just going to make the recommendation that we will have both the key theme summary and the summary of questions received as part of the appendix of the final report. They will also be available on Ocean Science Trust's webpage. Erin, does that resonate with you? Does that feel like the right way to go to have it be appendix?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. And I'm going to, we'll resend, we have a few folks asking about where the slides are available for download. I'm going to resend that right now via the chat, just so that you have that. And we'll do that right now. Thank you for your patience. My ability to type and talk is limited.
I'm going to jump in there and just say that I had Sanki's email wrong. So before you download them, once we're done here, I'll go into the slide deck and fix that. And so as soon as this webinar is over, just give us a few moments. We'll re-upload the slide deck. It should be sanki.mastrop and then at wildlife.ca.gov. So should be two names in there. That's how you know it's the right one.
And maybe to say out loud as well, you also mentioned on slide 7, I think it was, that we wanted to put the OPC SAT Executive Committee. We can make that slight adjustment as well. Awesome.
Yep. Okay.
That sounds great. So those were, I think, our questions, our sort of remaining questions on our end, process-wise. I'm just looking through the chat to see if there are any other questions that have come in. Haley, anything else via email that we should pause on?
Nope, no emails coming through the list so far.
Okay. That sounds fantastic. And I think, again, acknowledging that Ocean Science Trust is going to be putting together this key theme summary. We can talk about sort of the general timing of that. But I would, and Erin, I'm just sort of making things up, so let me know if this doesn't feel right. But I would say that, you know, into this afternoon, perhaps till 5 o'clock, if folks have additional questions that come in, please feel free to email abalone@calost.org. I think anything after 5, you know, we'll get a little bit, we'll want to make sure we're starting to work on the key theme summary. But if there's some tail end questions that folks have, that they could send them via email. Does that feel okay?
Yes, I think that sounds great.
Wonderful.
We'd love that. Yep.
Wonderful. Perfect. So I think we could probably move into our sort of next steps, email, next steps slide.
Yes. Oops. So back here, Kelly?
Yes, please. That would be wonderful.
Okay, great. Okay. Sorry, just catching up to myself.
No, I said the wrong title. This is perfect.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, and just wanting to remind you guys of where we're at in the process, you know, we're going to be wrapping up the peer review, and there's going to be a public release of the final report towards the end of September. There's going to be a second community engagement webinar after the release of the final report. Looking forward to finding a date for that in early October as well. Noting the Fish and Game Commission meeting coming up in October 17th and 18th in Fresno. And as Kelly said, you know, please continue to email us with questions, information needs about the peer review process itself. At abalone@calost.org. We try to be really responsive to folks as best we can through that email. And just thank you so much for your participation today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to being in touch soon. And again, in the meantime, if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Kelly, would we like to look at the Trello board?
I think that sounds wonderful. Yeah, I think that sounds wonderful. Okay. I was actually just looking at it right now, and there's one parking lot item that we might want to circle back. We have a few minutes. I think we can. So yes, Erin, if you're comfortable making your way over to the Trello board, this is a publicly accessible board. We use it kind of like a whiteboard to gather folks' thoughts, and it's also linked on the OST's Red Abalone page. So just know in the webinar materials, it's linked there for folks to be able to access. And in addition to trying our best to reflect the questions that came in across each of the bins, it may be worthwhile to circle back on one of the parking lot questions that didn't fit from my perspective right into a bin, but it may in terms, and this was from Alex Harper with Senkus, Senkus, I'm saying it right, where monitoring fits and how that is being considered as part of the management plan. So maybe we could just pause there for a moment.
Yeah, this is a great question. Thanks, Alex. You know, I think that both plans have different ways that they're using different data sets or thinking about potential future data sets. And it's something that the peer review panel is considering as it relates to the way that it's described in each of the plans themselves. And this is another great spot where, you know, we really encourage you to reach out to the teams to kind of share with them your thoughts on different types of data sets, on data sharing, and be able to have conversations with them. At the department, you can reach out to Sankey. Also on our website, we have the contact for Alexis Jackson at the Nature Conservancy, and Alexis and Sankey can both kind of help speak to how the teams are thinking about different types of data streams.
That's fantastic. And maybe just building on that, I think the other two parking lot items that are in here as well, again, you know, being mindful of the questions, but that they could also be specific for following back up with Sankey related to the department's consideration of density and sort of the public's trust in that. And then the ongoing conversation, we did have quite a conversation about it today, but just this, I think the rapid assessment and clarification perhaps in how rapid assessment either differs or you know, can be used compared to a longer, I think that was shortened versus a normal assessment that Jack had talked about. So perhaps another thing that could be followed up with Sankey directly, being thoughtful of all things. And then just want to say that in addition to the items that are highlighted on the Trello board as you make your way across, the primary next step that's come out of today's conversation is really the development of a summary of key themes that came out of this conversation, this webinar, and continuing to keep you all informed as you're interested on when the final peer review report becomes available, and as Erin mentioned, this anticipated second public webinar that we hope to have likely in early October. And so again, if you have not been receiving emails about this webinar, if you received maybe the information through the department's Marine Region News or other places and you'd like a more direct email, please feel free to be in touch with Abalone at calost.org and we can add you to that list. But we'll also continue to partner with the department to let folks know when this second webinar is available as well.
Great.
Perfect. Yeah.
Just going to make my way back to where that email address lives and just say once again, just any last words, Kelly?
No, I think this is fabulous. Other than just saying, yeah, thank you. Just reiterating, wonderful.
All right, great. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone again for taking the time to be a part of today's discussion and making this dialogue just really successful by sharing really important thoughts and considerations from everyone. I just want to thank again everybody who joined. Want to thank the peer review panelists for making time for this discussion, as well as the support from the rest of the Ocean Science Trust team and Strategic Earth. And I think that's it.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Erin.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah, please.
Oh, there's a hand.
Oh, a hand. Perfect. Do we have Alan
Joe?
Hi, yeah.
Alan Joe.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yep.
Go right ahead.
Okay, this is Jocelyn again. I just wanted to thank everyone who put on the webinar, and also one quick clarification about the way that my question was recorded there on the Trello board. It says we have I'm requesting a comparison of the management strategies. And I just wanted to make it more explicit there that the comparison that I'm requesting is actually a comparison of those specific environmental indicators that were addressed, right? The kelp density, the sea surface temperature, and the urchin density. But I didn't see that those were specifically called out there. Very excited to hear what the peer review team has to say about the approach taken by each one of the management strategies.
Thanks so much for that clarification, Jocelyn. That's really great. And we have just scooted that that Trello card back over to environmental. And again, we'll make sure that we're being thoughtful in our notes. There have been more copious notes taken as opposed to the Trello board, but really appreciate that clarification.
Okay, thank you everyone again. And looking forward again, if we didn't get to something or there's additional clarifications or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to us, or if again, the department's really open to hearing from you, so feel free to reach out to them as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Ocean Science Trust. So